Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to our afternoon session, the first panel of the afternoon. Thank you to Rebecca and to everyone at the Paul Mellon Centre for giving me the opportunity to be involved in this conference. It's such a nice chance. I think, particularly in academia, we're so used to working within our specialist fields. It's nice to be part of a conference that ranges across such a great geographical and temporal area for once. So I don't have a clever etymology or anything to introduce this panel. I could read you a poem, not by me, but maybe I'll save it for the end. So you can relax, it's not by me. But I will introduce our three speakers for this afternoon. We have Alice Mercier, a writer and AHRC-funded PhD researcher in visual culture at the University of Westminster. Her research studies how 19th century photography was theorized through short fiction of the time. She holds a BA in photographic arts and an MFA in creative writing from Cornell University, where she taught undergraduate writing. Her fiction appears in Epoch magazine, The Cupboard Pamphlet, The Wax Paper, and Smoke Long Quarterly, and her essay titled The Photography of Short Stories is published in the Journal of the Short Story in English. Then we have Ruth Ezra, a lecturer in art history at the University of St Andrews, specialising in the material and visual culture of early modern Northern Europe. After completing her PhD at Harvard University, she served as a postdoctoral scholar with the USC Society of Fellows in the Humanities. From 2022 to 23, she was a Nomis Fellow at Icones at the Universität Basel, where she convened the international workshop Materializing Transparency. Her current book project, Leaves of Glass, Mica Between Art and Science in Early Modernity, has received additional support from the Paul Mellon Centre, the Historians of Netherlandish Art, the Design History Society, INHA, and the Henry Moore Foundation. And then finally, we have Deborah Schultz, a senior lecturer in art history and course leader of the BA in art history at Regent's University in London. Her research explores institutional critique, photographic practices and archives, and the representation of memory in 20th century and contemporary art. Her PhD thesis at the University of Oxford was published as Marcel Brutte's, we discussed this at lunch and it's gone out of my head, Strategy and Dialogue, which was published by Peter Lang in 2007. And she is co-convener with Andrew Cheshire of the conference, London's Art Networks, and Marcel Brutte's, there is again, in the 1970s, so that was in 2023. She has recently co-edited with Geraldine Johnson Photo Archives and the Place of Photography, and she is a regular contributor to Art Monthly and other contemporary art journals. So a very rich afternoon. First of all, we have Alice Mercier presenting online, and her paper is called Photographic Looking Before Photography, Watching Through Windows in Early to Mid-19th Century Short Storytelling. Thank you. So Alice, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to say thank you to everyone here. And also thank you for making it possible for me to join remotely. So I'll just share my screen, but yeah, do let me know if it doesn't look how you're expecting it to. Okay, so yes, thank you for the introduction. So I'm a PhD student funded by the AHRC, and I'm looking in part at how photography was presented, narrated, and perhaps imagined in the 19th century. And I'm especially interested in what photographs were presented as being aside from indexical. So as well as being a physical trace or imprint of the thing photographed, what else chemical photography was presented as doing or offering. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about today were just really some thoughts on whether one way that photography was posited was as a kind of extension of the window. So the idea that the window in the 19th century or in visual culture from the 19th century provided a kind of precursor or indication for how photographs were presented and how viewers were invited to look at them. So the imagery of the window that I'll refer mostly to here is from mid-19th century storytelling. But I wanted to start with just a very brief note on window glass from the time, because window glass making was perhaps in a state of transition in Britain around the time of photography's announcement in 1839, and because that transition can perhaps also be understood as a kind of effort to clarify and stabilize a view. So the first half of the 19th century saw a move in window glass making in Britain, as elsewhere, away from smaller panes of crown glass, especially in Britain, and towards larger panes of increasingly flat and transparent plate glass. So although this transition was gradual and distortions in the glass were not completely resolved by the mid-century, there was, I think, nevertheless, this broader movement towards transparency and kind of perceived texturelessness in window glass. The illustration on this slide is just from a kind of advertisement trade card for a new storefront from 1841. So this transition coincides with the announcement of chemically fixed photographs at the end of the 1830s. And I'll just show an image that likely predates that announcement by several years from Henry Fox Talbot, showing what we would now describe as a kind of negative image of a window. So yeah, what I'm interested in is the possibility that there is a kind of parallel here between photography and window glass that is to do with an effort to stabilize the view, perhaps with the aspiration for the material surface of the glass or image to eventually dissolve from awareness. And I will also just briefly note a few references to the effects that plate glass was perceived to have had on the visual environment, for example, of marketplaces. So in a travel opinion article from 1860, a writer equates the industriousness of workers in marketplaces in Istanbul with the absence of plate glass there in comparison with London, with the implication that plate glass is distracting and disruptive to work in the city. In 1892, the Strand magazine notes of its own offices that curious passers-by can observe the publisher's operations through the large plate glass windows of their buildings. And in this case, plate glass renders work itself as something of a spectacle to be watched from outside. And in another article from 1892, Arthur Morrison writes of Leadenhall Market, which is shown in the illustration on the slide. The arcades and plate glass fronts have altered the more kind of organic logic of the marketplace. So I think here it's maybe possible to see plate glass as delimiting or boundarying the space while offering the possibility to see more, or see more on display than before. And I think this might be another way to think about what photography was shown to offer at the time, by determining a view while offering the possibility to see more than before, and specifically to see more detail than was otherwise thought to be shown in other kinds of images. So this point is made by Talbot in The Pencil of Nature, which he published in the 1840s, where photographs are said to include detail that no artist would expend the time and effort to copy. And then in Oliver Wendell Holmes's 1859 essay titled The Stereoscope and the Stereograph, and I'll just put up an illustration of a photographic stereograph from the time. Holmes asserts that there will always be something new to find in a quote-unquote perfect photograph, including details that have never been seen before other than by the camera. So details that the camera has seen, but the photographer hasn't, or potentially hasn't. And this idea of the camera seeing more than or differently from the photographer is described in Kaja Silverman's book, The Miracle of Analogy, also in relation to the vantage point of Talbot's photograph of the window, about which Silverman writes, quote, "The camera obscura sat on the mantelpiece across from this window, a position from which only the fireplace could have looked," end quote. Also in The Pencil of Nature by Talbot, he suggests that it may be possible for the camera to produce a portrait in a darkened room where, quote, "If there were a number of persons in the room, no one would see the other, and yet a camera could take their portrait and reveal their actions," end quote. So there are maybe these two interrelated things presented, which are photography's potential to show a view in clear detail, so a level of detail which could in theory be seen by eye, but which tended not to be reproduced in other images. And then additionally, the potential for photography to show something that would not otherwise be available or accessible to vision. So both the potential to represent a view in high definition, but also the potential to reveal something that wasn't in view or wasn't considered visible. So here I'll look briefly at how the window is presented to perhaps do something similar in the narratives of several short stories from the time, as a kind of site that exposes something that would otherwise be overlooked, disregarded, or just not visible. So in a story titled A House to Let, published in 1858, a character looks at a house across the street from her own and notices an eye watching her from one of the windows. And she initially attributes this look of an eye to a flaw in the window glass, and so tries to recreate the image of an eye through the reflections and flaws in the glass, but is unable to. And then in a story published in 1879, titled Number 2 Melrose Square, the protagonist passes a tall window in the stairwell and notices the reflection of a stranger behind her. Again, the character initially disregards this as a flaw in the glass. And in this story, part of the horror of the awful window, as the narration refers to it, is its uninterrupted exposure. So by day, it is, quote, bare and blank and filled with raw white daylight. And at night, it appears to reflect back the spirits that haunt the house. So in both stories, window glass is presumed to have produced an illusion at first before being realized as the screen by which something that is otherwise hidden, unseen, forgotten, or fleeting is revealed. And in both stories, the window is also seen to kind of look back at the protagonist. It is said to frown on the character in the later story. So that's the quote on this slide. Whereas the window in A House to Let seemingly reproduces the look of an eye. And then the next story, which I'll read in a little more detail, is The Man of the Crowd by Edgar Allan Poe. So originally published earlier in 1840, and set in a coffee house in London. The protagonist watches the people passing by on the other side of the glass during evening rush hour, as the gaslight comes on in the street outside. And so he starts categorizing people in the crowd, presuming he can read a whole range of things about their lives and identities as they pass by. Quote, although the rapidity with which the world of light flitted before the window prevented me from casting more than a glance upon each visage, still it seemed that, in my then peculiar mental state, I could frequently read, even in that brief interval of a glance, the history of long years. So at the start of the story, the protagonist is described, quote, peering through the smoky panes and with his, quote, brow to the glass, end quote. The window is, at least initially, presented as a potential barrier to observation, and the character is required to navigate the glass in order to see through it. But once the glass fades from awareness, what the narration notes instead is the protagonist's ability to read, quote, even in that brief interval of a glance, the history of long years. So as the material screen of the glass seemingly dissolves from view, the protagonist is said to believe he can see not only the people passing by, but also the pasts or histories of those people, along with their presumed dispositions. In other words, when the barrier of the glass ceases to be registered as such, the protagonist is shown to acquire the ability to read that which is otherwise visually unavailable. And a related point is made in a recent article that looked at the potential impact of windows on witness testimony in the 1800s, and the claim, quote, to be able to fix the class to which a passerby belongs from visual observation alone. So this article asks specifically as well whether, quote, something inherent to the clear glass window itself as a novel, transparent technology of urban observation tended to enhance the confidence of the person immediately behind it in their ability to correctly interpret the visual data conveyed, end quote. And I think the window as it had appeared in storytelling, and perhaps in visual culture more broadly, suggests this idea that the more glass could be made to fade from visual awareness, perhaps either through the glazing itself or through the observer's navigation of the glass, the more potential there was for an observer to see things that were not otherwise or generally considered visible or available to vision. The apparent dissolve of the glass interface corresponded, or arguably corresponded, with the feeling of a heightened awareness of or sensitivity to the world on the other side. Or otherwise, the act of getting the glass to appear to disappear seemed to allow for the display of that which was not generally otherwise visible or perhaps even material. And so I just wanted to close with an image from Talbot's Pencil of Nature. So this is from I think the first volume published in 1844, described as a view taken from one of the upper windows of a hotel. So a view from a window rather than the earlier view of a window, which actually, again, Silverman writes about in The Miracle of Analogy, is the idea of the earlier photograph being of a window rather than from a window. And so the text that appears with this image in the Pencil of Nature narrates a scene that is presumably remembered or imagined to have unfolded in front of the camera, either in the time leading up to the exposure or during the long exposure time itself. Quote, "The sun is just quitting the range of buildings adorned with columns. The weather is hot and dusty, and they have just been watering the road, which has produced two broad bands of shade, which unite in the foreground because, the road being partially under repair, the watering machines have been compelled to cross to the other side. A whole forest of chimneys borders the horizon, for the instrument chronicles whatever it sees, and certainly would delineate a chimney pot with the same impartiality as it would the Apollo of Belvedere," end quote. So with this, I think Talbot asserts both the camera's impartiality as evidenced, or the idea of the camera's impartiality as evidenced by the detailed view of everyday things, while also arguably inviting the reader to see that which can only be read into the image: the sun setting, the people watering the road, machines crossing the street. The narration describes a series of past events unfolding, presented as though rendered in the image, not quite the history of long years that Poe's protagonist sees at a glance through the window, but nevertheless, the photograph is perhaps offered here as a site for seeing more than is there. And more broadly, over the course of the 19th century, it wasn't unusual that the camera or the photographic plate were considered capable of registering things that weren't otherwise considered available to see, such as energetic forces, spirits, souls, psychic projections. So photography in the 19th century was arguably imbued with this potential for an experience of seeing more than was otherwise tangible or visually available. And I wonder if this, so like my kind of question is, I wonder if this can be understood to follow in part an experience of viewing that have perhaps already been intimated through the window in visual culture of the time. Okay, so I think I will, stop there. And thank you so much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you very much, Alice, and I hope you could hear us clapping for you. I'll now introduce Ruth. So this is Ruth Ezra. If you'd like to make your way up, she's going to be speaking to the title Muscovy Glass from Fenestration to Demonstration. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to Christina for the generous introduction and to Rebecca for bringing us all together. In his 1859 how-to guide, The Art of Architectural Modeling in Paper, London architect T.A. Richardson lists the materials required of his craft: wire, lead, board, velvet, beechwood, and sheets of mica to be procured at the ironmongers and used for windows, skylights, etc. Richardson goes on to detail mica's particular usefulness for modeling a greenhouse. Not only the mineral's transparency, but also its thin cleavage, ease of cutting, and relative flexibility, it could be bent around a cylinder, aided the construction of a many-paned house in miniature. My talk this afternoon tells the story of how white mica took hold in the British imaginary to emerge as the material of choice, not just for Richardson's reader, but for fenestration modeled across 3 centuries of artistic and scientific practice. I argue that the mineral's availability in the British Isles from the mid-16th century onward, spurred by Anglo-Russian trade, created new possibilities for the materialization and miniaturization of transparency in general and of fenestration in specific. Beginning with objects produced in the early modern period, I introduce examples from an embroidered palace to an optical toy that are both architectural in form and diminutive in size. These small-scale mineral-glazed windows served as both teaching tools and testaments of skill, facilitating education in practical mathematics and optics on the one hand, and drawing room travel and entertainment on the other. Mica's incorporation into such an expanded field of the British architectural imaginary dramatizes a culture of interaction between art and science, amateurs and experts, foreign lands, and domestic spaces. In 1568, the English poet George Tuberville wrote from Russia to friends in London, describing the, quote, manners of the country and people. Among the observations he conveyed in verse were the following lines. They have no English glass, of slices of a rock called sluta, they their windows make, that English glass doth mock. They cut it very thin, and sew it with a thread, in pretty order like to panes, to serve their present need. No other glass, good faith, doth give a better light. And sure, the rock is nothing rich, the cost is very slight. Tuberville's sluta, which translates to rock or cliff, is the potassium aluminum silicate hydroxide we now call muscovite or white mica, and what by the 17th century English writers would increasingly refer to by the anglicized name of Muscovy glass, denoting its origins. Tuberville was stationed in Moscow as secretary to Thomas Randolph, Elizabeth's ambassador to Ivan IV, and by the time of the poet's writing, English merchants had enjoyed duty-free trade with the Russian Tsar for just over a decade, the Muscovy Company having been chartered in 1555. English merchant ships followed the route shown here across the Barents Sea Passage, down the northern Dvina River Delta, and onwards to Moscow. Slude, still a curiosity to Tuberville, would emerge in the subsequent century as an export commodity particularly important for England's maritime economy and navy. This was due to the mineral's robust transparency and imperviousness, which rendered it efficacious at glazing portals not just on land, but at sea as well. And in this late 17th century warship model, Slude represents itself, albeit scaled down substantially. To return to Tuberville and Muscovy, though, the poet's 1568 verse describes what he clearly judged at the time to be a rudimentary form of fenestration. Windows composed of variously sized mineral laminae sewn and set into tinned grills, as this recent exhibition installation attests. Tuberville's observations regarding the curious glazes of Muscovite houses would be repeated again and again by English travelers, who in subsequent decades made the same journey to Moscow and beyond. Giles Fletcher, in particular, praises the mineral's performance against 2 of its visual cognates, horn and glass. In the case of horn, which is now considered the plastic of the Middle Ages, we see evidence of mica's quick replacement in lantern windows, and these are survivals from Jamestown, and in the fenestre, that is the windows, to both manuscripts and didactic horn books. And here you see a probably 17th century mica repair to a late 16th century horn book. Children who learned their ABCs handling primers like this one soon graduated to new arenas of education, though, and for girls, that was embroidery. And indeed, a century after Turberville's writing, his tale of thinly sliced rocks sewn with thread was rather ingeniously instantiated, and one can say domesticated, in the hands of teenagers who, back home in England, reached for mica's diminutive leaves when glazing the fictive architectures in which they set biblical needlework narratives. Raised work cabinets such as this one served as demonstrative masterworks, the culmination of a girl's embroidery education. Not only do these fantasy cityscapes model in microcosm the real-life slude-paned buildings of faraway Muscovy, and I would say right down to the sewn construction of the lattice windows, but they attest to the way that a peculiar mineral commodity, sourced via the Barents Sea, delivered into the workshops of English craftspeople a ready-made solution to a perpetual artistic problem, which had previously tested the limits of even the most accomplished painters. And that is the problem of representing transparent materials like windows and their fleeting light effects. The mineral would, in turn, aid understanding of another persistent stumbling block for painters, especially amateurs. That is the mathematics behind perspective. For at the same time that Muscovy glass was circulating through the haberdashery shops and drawing rooms of London's needlework network, it was being passed around Gresham College. Women of leisure and men of letters both saw windows in specular stone. Here, in a pop-up model from instrument maker and mathematics teacher Joseph Moxon's 1670 Practical Perspective, the first treatise on the subject published in English, a paper frame serves to secure and deliver a physical sample of the mineral to the hands of the book's user, while at the same time literalizing the otherwise abstract concept of an Albertian window. Few readers would witness the construction material at scale in its capacity as a glaze for Muscovite houses, but any could now touch and look through it, mounted in a printed book. Moxon incorporates the mica window to reify the mathematical concept of the perspectival section he defines alongside the fugitive sheet. By incorporating mica into the three-dimensional design of his book, though, he also proves himself familiar with the latest material investigations of the Royal Society, which he wished to join as a fellow. Indeed, within Moxon's London milieu, the composition of slude held as much interest as did any of its applications, one of which, a compass cover, I illustrate here. Robert Hooke, for example, devotes several pages of his 1665 Micrographia to the nature and colors of thin bodies like Muscovy glass. He appears overcome by the numerous and remarkable properties of the material, quote, a body that seems to have as many curiosities in its fabric as any common mineral I have met with. The writings of John Wilkins, later experiments of Hooke, an inventory of Nehemiah Grew all attest to the early Royal Society's extensive engagement with mica's physical characteristics alongside its practical applications. By the 18th century, the arena of the mineral's extraction extended into Siberia. As Joseph Rachnitz writes in his treatise on the presentation and history of the taste of the leading nations, published in 1796, though I should say he mistakes it for its visual cognate selenite. In the section on Siberia, he describes mica's sourcing there and states that, quote, "it is used to make window panes, as no glass is found to equal it in brightness and clarity." He continues, "it is used everywhere to make lanterns and windows on ships, as it withstands all shocks." Of note, he explicitly uses the comparison of mica to water as a judgment of its quality, which is to say the level of transparency deemed most favorable for actual windows, as well as those deployed in models. To go back for a second, teenage women embroiderers, ever ingenious with their material mimetics, had in fact already in the mid-17th century exploited what we might call mica's arrested liquidity to represent the splash of water in fantasy grottos, splashes made all the more animated with the user's movement around the window. And it was precisely this affordance of the mineral to capture so well the skittish surface of water that we see exploited in later topographic models like this one of the Chatham Dockyard from 1774, which shows masts lying seasoned beneath a single mica sheet. Also in the 18th century, it bears noting that anonymous craftspeople used light, flexible, transparent mica as the background fenestration for export luxuries like this chinoiserie lorgnette fan. And so with this architectural model of a sort, we return to Richardson. In closing, though, I wish to add one final window to our gallery, which is the optical toy at right, designed and produced by optician J. Newman at his London premises, 122 Regent Street, which is not so far from here. Newman mounted the mica pane on this model window at just such an angle that the combination of a black glass mirror positioned at the base of the frame and a nickel prism or calcite polarizer would result in the spectator seeing a stained glass window in place of the transparent pane visible with the naked eye and captured in this image. And I should say that a polarizer, right, is essentially a filter that causes light that passes through it to vibrate in only one direction. The usual metaphor is to a picket fence. And mica, in turn, changes the orientation of polarized light by 90 degrees. And this results in what is the so-called interference color. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to produce a reconstruction of this effect due to access restrictions on the Science Museum collection currently. But I would add that didactic polarization slides of mica were common across 19th century optical demonstration collections. This is one example from my home institution of St. Andrews. And long may the experiments continue. This is mica as seen through the polarizer window at left and double polarized at right. And both were photographed thanks to some scientist friends that I met at a workshop on light and color this summer. And so I would say that the best colleagues are clearly those who carry polarizers in their wallets. So from fenestration to demonstration. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And finally, we have Deborah Schultz, and her title is The Window as a Lens in the Work of Anna Barriball.
Thanks so much to Rebecca and all the other organizers and all the other wonderful speakers. I've really enjoyed the diversity of the conference. So in a way, this is quite different from all the fascinating papers, and I will move straight on. Windows may easily be overlooked. They are not usually the main feature of a room, but they form an essential part of it. Those in the work of Anna Barrable are both generic and specific. They look like windows in general, lacking the specific details of a casement or sash window. However, her intricate working process brings out their detailed specificity, such as the type of textured glass that was so popular from the late 19th century until the 1970s. And I saw so much wonderful textured glass at the Paul Mellon Centre. I think Anna would absolutely love it. Barrable's complex and time-consuming processes grant these windows a significance, and they become worthy of our focused attention. As Anne Gallagher has observed, she uses the act of drawing to define presence. Cited at the interface between the inside and outside, windows relate well to Barrable's practice, in which objects remain ordinary while becoming significant. If a painting is a window onto the world, what happens when the painting or drawing is of a window? Through a range of highly complex processes, the resulting images pick up details that might otherwise be overlooked. As Barrable has commented on her practice, it's about engaging with something on a forensic level and using a process of heightened looking. This paper takes as its starting point recent works on display in our Anna Barrable's spring exhibition at Frith Street Gallery in London. Titled New Drawings, the exhibition included works such as Studio Window Blue Fade and Window Blue Twilight that you can see here, in which the form of a window appears to materialize from the direct effect of light on a light-sensitive surface. These large-scale drawings were based on windows in Barrable's South London studio. The colours resemble sugar paper, which has faded in the light, only retaining the original colour where the paper has been obscured. They are also reminiscent of early cyanotypes, such as these by Anna Atkins, reminding us that the etymological origin of the word photography is drawing with the light. And we have seen this a few times this week, but to quote William Henry Fox Talbot's description in The Pencil of Nature of his own early photographs, he wrote, "They seem to have been impressed by nature's hand," while the window motif also recalls Talbot's photograph of the lattice window in the South Gallery of Laycock Abbey. In fact, the works on display in New Drawings were very much the product of Barrable's own hand. Following a complex process, the artist begins by dusting rectangles of paper with coloured pastel, carefully ensuring that the whole surface is evenly covered, or creating a gradation of colour, such as you see in the image on the right here. Very hot wax is applied, which permeates the paper, rendering it and its soft colour semi-translucent. The resulting works are both flat drawings and thinly layered sculptural objects. Such images take time to appear, in contrast to the immediacy of many photographic practices. As Selina Barry has noted, Barrable's images are not merely representations of windows in the artist's studio or otherwise, but of specific moments in time in which they have existed. The work's wax coatings have wrinkles and grooves that resemble the ridges of a large fingerprint, hinting at the uniqueness of these moments, while also attempting to encase them, to fix them in time, like objects suspended in resin. Barrable describes her small-scale works as handheld drawings, akin to Polaroid images that gradually develop in one's hands, highlighting their tactile and intimate qualities. In the rose-coloured series After Image, and you see an image here, which is the one in the middle of this series, the sun appears to project through a window an image of flickering leaves on a wall. The central image in the series of 7 is the strongest. The leaves are just there, while they are less clearly recognizable in the other images as the light gradually intensifies and fades. The artist's finger or thumbprint, can't really see it on this scale, but they can be seen at the top of each image, reminding the viewer of the handmade process from which the images derive. Meanwhile, Barable's silent digital video, you see a screenshot there on the right, the son, Rosa's room, focuses on the brief play of shadows on the wall of her daughter's room, whereas after image derived from images on the wall of her own childhood bedroom. Although the starting point for these and other works have a personal dimension to them, the personal is not entirely disclosed, and these are not autobiographical works, but explore commonplace features that we may easily overlook. The colours of these two works are related too, with the peachy rose of after image a lighter version of the deeper tone of the sun, Rosa's room. The room of each work functions like a camera obscura, in which intangible images are captured and preserved. In the video, the light flickers as the shadows of trees projected onto the wall are akin to memories fading in and out. In each of these images, the window acts like a lens, framing and capturing transient images, while the wall or the drawing enables the fragile images to be held and seen. These works then resemble photographic images with painterly qualities, rather than what we might expect from drawings, and form part of the artist's ongoing engagement with mark making on paper. Her choice of objects includes not only windows, but also doors, curtains, shutters, fireplaces, walls, and other thresholds or in-between architectural features, which are often found in the spaces where the artist has lived or worked. A couple more examples here. Barable's working processes attend to the surfaces of these objects. In other words, the places where we come into physical contact with them. Although the artist's body is rarely visible in her works, her practice is closely tied to the ways in which she physically engages with surfaces. As she has commented, the act of drawing is a central concern of mine. It is a way of opening up a dialogue between myself and the things around me. This physicality finds itself embedded in Barable's working processes. As Margaret Iverson writes, Barable's approach to drawing is like seeing objects with one's fingertips, making the tactile world available to sight. In comparable terms, Bryony Fair has described Barable's process as a way of imprinting the world without depicting it, and so it is indexical, like a finger or a footprint, and like a photograph too, or at least a pre-digital kind of photograph, where an image is imprinted on light-sensitive paper. The indexicality of Barable's processes gives her work a kind of literal matter-of-factness. There was a window, or a door, or another surface that she attended to in some way, granting the resulting images a high level of detail, as well as a kind of all-overness that does not prioritize one part of the original object over another. The works are to scale, reinforcing this literalness, which offsets their handmade qualities. As Barable has commented, I think it's a question of representation and the closeness to the real thing. The drawings never completely let go of the real. So it is worth noting here that in the exhibition at Frith Street Gallery, the window works were hung, there we are, at the same height as in the studio building on which they were based, their literalness thereby reiterated. At the same time, the magicality of the photographic-like process transforms these fixtures into subjects worthy of our prolonged consideration. Why then this interest in windows? Barable has said that they draw attention to the dilemmas of looking. The viewer, the person doing the looking, is central to her practice, making them aware that they are looking at something as much as what they are looking at. As Bryony Fair has pointed out, rather than providing a transparent surface to look through, the dilemmas of looking take place in that space of the encounter, between the work and the viewer, not beyond it. It is not for nothing that bricked-up windows are called blind, or, for that matter, that blinds are called blind." End quote. Looking through thus becomes looking at. The usual function of a window is hindered by the opacity of the paper and of the colour. Light cannot pass through these windows. However, the wax causes them to emanate light off this soft surface, and the colour here is blue, like the sky beyond. There is a tension between open and closed or inward-looking spaces. For Barrable, her work should be a starting point for thoughts, holding, as she says, at least an initial intrigue, rather than a clearly defined endpoint in which everything is self-explanatory. Fiona Bradley has commented on this too, stating that what we see is what we see, and the meaning of the works seems nothing more or less than the fact of their existence. Nevertheless, as Bradley continues, there is something about their blunt insistence on being exactly what they are that leads to the sense that there may be something more. They may be blocking something off or something in. These window works that I have focused on form part of an ongoing interest by the artist. In this diptych from 2019, the black bars of leaded lights are literally suspended between the glass of the frame and a piece of perspex, causing their shadow to fall onto the drawing beneath. With regard to the series Mirror Window Wall, much earlier series, each work comprises 4 framed silver sheets arranged to resemble a window. Transparency gives way to opacity as the windows become more like walls. The texture of the glass surfaces shiny and opaque like mirrors. To produce sunrise, sunset that you see on the right here, Barrable rubbed over an Art Deco glass panel with a 2B pencil. Covering the surface methodically, it becomes one of lead, the material of the pencil marks forming an even surface. And a different kind of opacity or covering up occurs in this much earlier image in which the artist covered with white paper all of the windows apart from one in found images of buildings. So in each image from the series, only one window from the building remains. Finally, by contrast, to produce detail, which you see here, Barrable focused on a detail of a found photograph and enlarged it, curious to see what the mysterious form was behind the glass, behind the window. Placed high on the wall in the gallery, its position was like that of an actual window. As she said in an interview, "I'm interested in the confusion of being inside or outside, in a liminal space, thresholds that are no longer ways in or ways out, drawings that hold you in the space while hinting at what might be beyond the surface." Thank you.
Wow, I think that 3 fascinating papers that speak to each other in really interesting ways. And I think, Deborah, there you've sort of summed up the whole conference, that we're looking at something that we normally look through. So I quite like that as a sort of summation of what we're doing. So before I open up, while you're formulating your questions, I thought I might take the chair's prerogative and ask a question of all 3 of you, because it seems to me that there's something interesting going on in each of your papers about the issue of literalism. So Alice, you said you were trying to move away from the indexical idea of the window, and the idea of this. I love this particularly Tudor approach to using materials in other materials and Jacobean to have mica, that you can't just put a window in. Oh, a bit louder for a second. You can't just embroider a window. You have to have something that pretty much resembles glass in your embroidery of glass. And of course, you spoke a lot about literalism, but I wonder if you had anything to say to each other on the subject of literalism, or yes, I'll just stop there.
Yes, I think in my case, what's so striking about mica in what we could sort of categorize as models, right? All of my case studies is that mica represents itself, so it sort of plays itself at reduced size at smaller scale, and that's quite distinctive of a material at that time. I mean, you can, in the case of the embroidered windows, you can't actually put glass into those because you can't do what you can do with mica, which is to put a needle through, right, to actually attach it. So all of these affordances or properties of mica, right? It's kind of robust flexibility, its ability to be cut, its thin cleavage. They allow it, as I say, to sort of represent itself and to model itself. So I think it then encourages meditation on this question of what does it mean for something to stand for itself.
And something, of course, you see in other miniature genres with gold literally standing for gold, and something Nicholas Hilliard goes on and on and on about. But sort of, gold is gold and silver. It worketh the metals with itself in miniature painting. There's a kind of literalism there. Yeah.
Yeah, though I should say, maybe as a nice segue to to windows of other materials, is that it's also some of the I guess semantic field, right, of what words that were used to refer to mica in the early modern period. It's also referred to as cat silver, so it's a kind of ersatz silver. Some of the less transparent varieties of mica, right, look more like quartzite sort of silver. So perhaps that is a good entree to lead and other material windows.
Yes, I guess, yes. I suppose there's a sort of mixture in Barabel's work where that lead from the pencil sort of, you end up sort of looking at that material, whereas but at the same time, there's obviously an illusion as well. But I actually had a question for Ruth about mica, and it just seems such an amazing material. And I was wondering what happened to it. When did we stop using it?
Well, I mean, the short answer is we haven't. When people ask me this, right, I say if you have any sparkly eyeshadow in your makeup bag, a lot of that has mica in it, as does your microwave. There are pieces of mica.
Microwave.
But in the 19th century, as is pertinent to a lot of the papers that we've heard today about photography, it was actually used as an experimental substrate for negatives. Neville Story Maskelyne, who becomes the first keeper of minerals at the British Museum and is a correspondent of Talbot's, produces negatives on mica that are still, I've seen some at the British Library and also at the Science and Media Museum. And he actually writes to Talbot and says, you should try mica, this this flexible material. And up until the late 19th century, in photography journals, there are little bulletins saying mica would be a perfect medium as a negative for panoramic landscape photography, precisely because you can curve it, right? That same curve that we see in the treatise on architectural models to get the kind of barreled roof, that same curve, right, can allow you to get the panorama of photography. And I should say that also with sort of a connection to the paper we heard yesterday about Calcutta and windows, that we know that mica, which is extracted from South India, that mica is also being used in colonial architectural projects as the glass in greenhouses that are being constructed, because it's cheaper than glass, and also withstands the elements, as I showed in the early modern period as well.
Thank you. And Alice, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I did. I don't know if it really properly answers your question though. But I was just thinking when you were talking about indexicality and also maybe to do with Anna Baribel's work as well. So I'm kind of was interested, well, partly I'm interested in, so one of the ways that Talbot introduces photographs in The Pencil of Nature is as kind of testimony to the thing photographed. And I feel like it's this strand that gets really picked up through photo theory as what is essentially different about photographs. But in Talbot's writing, I also just read it as one of an array of things that he's trying to say differentiates photographs from other kinds of images. And I read, like in the introduction, almost like this worry that readers won't know that they're essentially different in some way from engravings or other kinds of images. And so I'm kind of interested in that, along with the idea that there is, not necessarily immediately, but maybe over the course of the 19th century, the trajectory for perhaps, this is to put it really, maybe to oversimplify it, but this trajectory towards kind of trying to get the surface of something to be less apparent. And so I was really interested in that in relation to Anna Barrible's work, because it feels like that's like there's a kind of way of reintroducing or reprioritizing the kind of tactility and the like marks of making, I guess, in that work. This isn't, I don't think this answers your question at all. I'm sorry. That was just like thoughts that I
All very interesting.
That's very interesting because, as you say, with photography, it's about reducing that awareness of the surface, or at least that's an outcome of photography. Whereas Barrible's work, even if they have a kind of photographic quality, they're also very much about the surface. Yes, thank you. I'll think about that.
Thank you, everyone. And well, but let's see if anyone else has a question. Are there any? Don't be shy or too cold.
Yeah.
Raise your hand. Yes. Hello.
Thank you. Really terrific presentations. This is a question for Ruth. So, Micah, could you tell us a little bit about the means of production, particularly like in the 16th century when it was observed by the person you quoted, and what sorts of sizes were they able to produce at the time?
Thank you. So mica is, I wouldn't say that it's exactly mined. It's more extracted in books, which are quite evocatively named, from seams in the landscape. And what follows its extraction is the separation of the laminae, which are naturally quite thin of cleavage, in a process called dressing. And currently, I'm still doing more research on the means and sort of methods of extraction in the 17th century, as much as I can gather. But it seems to have been transported to the British Isles as it had already been certainly separated into books, if not dressed into sheets. The context that I know more about is in the 19th century and early 20th century, which is the extraction, as I mentioned, in India. There are photographs that, for example, in the collection of the Cambridge University Library, where you can see men, women, and children cutting mica, right, dressing it in mine. So you can do it with just quite a sharp knife. And in the 20th century, during the Second World War, when the British supplies of mica in India were cut off, seams were opened up in the Highlands in Scotland, and women were active on the home front in mica dressing factories. And again, the British Geological Survey has some wonderful photos where you can see women cutting it. So in short, it's not really work that's easily scaled or automated, right? It really is quite a sort of one person, one knife, one book to dress it. In terms of size, I think you can tell that in the earlier instances that I showed of its use, right, in the British Isles, it's much smaller, right? And some of the first accounts of it are as spangles, right, as sort of sequins that were used to decorate costumes at court masks. And so there seems to be this, there are kind of two stories you can tell about mica, right? One is as a glitter, right? As a spangle, as a powder, which is the waste product really that's produced by cutting it into leaves. And that's what, as I say, continues today with kind of eyeshadow and makeup. And then there's the other story you can tell about it as that leaf, right? As that kind of substrate, that surface. And that, I mean, as by the 18th century, right, in the Rocknitz, he's talking about it in terms of ells, which, right, is like the cubit, the measure of your lower arm. And there, I mean, it seems to be that you can get it to, 2, possibly 3 L's. So these are bigger pieces of mica, certainly, that are coming out of Siberia in the 18th century. But again, we're, part of its occurrence, right, in such a small size, such a small dimension in the 17th century, then encourages its use in these models. And it's from the account that's coming through from Turberville that you asked about at the beginning, it's also possible that, I have to say, based on rate books and sort of research I've done into architectural materials, that he could also be referring to windows that were constructed with sort of fish eggs that were sewed together, that there's there's another story to be told here about visual cognates with fish eggs and gelatin and isinglass or isinglass, and that being used in a kind of similar fashion and as a transparent material. So it's kind of this amazing field of visual cognates and also semantic slippages. But to be continued. Yeah.
Fish egg windows. Smells nice, probably. Are there any other questions? Yes.
I had a question for Alice, and it's about the role of urban life in what you've been looking at, both the photograph and the both the photograph and the short story. Because in the sociology of windows, there's this idea that windows allow us to suspend the norm of civil inattention, where when we spend life together in urban space, there's this norm that we don't pay too much attention to one another, that we sort of look away. But the protagonist in Poe's story that you introduced doesn't have the window frees him of this norm of civil inattention. And of course, I think of the many photographs that were being taken at the shop window that we heard about this morning, where photographs have also sort of changed norms of civil attention paid between people in urban space. So I was wondering if that's something that you've thought about of the development of both of these technologies and how they've affected sort of behavioral norms in the urban space.
Thank you so much. And also that's really interesting to know. So I would definitely like to read more about that if you have any kind of recommendations. I think I haven't researched much about this. I think partly because my research at the moment is to do with the kinds of spaces that photography might be seen to kind of grow out of. One of those is kind of glazed spaces, heavily glazed spaces, but otherwise dark rooms, also portrait studios that were also glazed. But I think what your question also reminded me of was the kind of the places where these larger expanses of plate glass were initially used or used most often earlier, which I think is with the shop front and the shop display, as a kind of, I think in Henty Lau's article, which is in the slides, this is like a place where the plate glass as status symbol can be used. And so I was thinking about this in storytelling as well as kind of places where the window stops having these other kind of functions that we might associate with the window, like allowing for the exchange of air, or as a way to kind of filter or change the color of light, kind of these other ways which it's also used to like interact, like people can interact. If they open the window, you can get air moving through the room, and so like the window almost becomes something different in these urban spaces. And so I'm kind of trying to think about whether that actually is an essentially different window from a kind of window that opens, because also in these stories there's a definite lack of interaction between characters that see each other through the window. In Poe's story especially, even when the protagonist follows this stranger that kind of catches his interest out into the street, even when they're in the street and they come face to face, they don't really see each other, or rather the stranger doesn't see Poe's protagonist. So it's almost like this screen of the window is still separating them. But yeah, I think the furthest I've thought about it so far is whether the kind of what I think in Anne Friedberg's The Virtual Window is kind of the glass wall as opposed to a window is really causing a different set of things to happen than windows that kind of open and maybe offer some kind of exchange. And also that maybe this like plate glazing creates a kind of micro climate or some kind of idea of like a different realm on the other side. This is a really convoluted response to your question, but yeah, I'm super interested in it. So if you have like recommendations or anything, please do feel free to send them over.
No, it's a fascinating answer. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think before, there's another question. We've got time for a quick one, please, in the pink scarf. Just, yeah.
It's a question for Deborah. I was just wondering, as far as I know, in former times, long ago, waxed paper was used instead of windows, or before glass windows. Does the artist in any way refer to that maybe by using wax in her technical process?
Oh, that's really interesting. Not as far as I'm aware. No. Annabelle's the artist's liaison at Fritz Street. So I'm looking at Annabelle. Not as far as I'm aware, or I think as far as Annabelle's aware.
As Deborah was saying, the draw to the wax as a material was very much due to the transformation that is undergone to the paper as object, as it becoming this thing that's quite translucent. And that was a really exciting moment for Anna, discovering that that could happen. But it's an interesting reference. I'll let her know when I next see her.
Thank you.
Well, that's lovely. Thank you very much, everyone. I think we should continue this conversation over drinks, but the refreshments, sorry. But I did promise you, it's been a long day for me. What time is it? Yeah. But I did promise you this poem, and I do think it sums up quite neatly some of the things about what we can see. Can we see more or less through a window? And also it sends us off into literary horrors quite nicely. So this is Louis MacNeice's Corner Seat. Suspended in a moving night, the face in the reflected train looks at first sight as self-assured as your own face, but look again. Windows between you and the world keep out the cold, keep out the fright. Then why does your reflection seem so lonely in the moving night? Thank you very much, everyone.